Well, welcome to another episode of RestorationCast.
Boy, it's good to see all of y'all.
This week we're going to be talking about the wilderness.
The wilderness. Going to jump right into the old wilderness.
Yes, which might be, it's a little odd, I guess, because the last several weeks we've been talking about actual, geographical locations.
Yeah.
This is supposed to be Bible geography.
Bible geography.
And the wilderness, while it is sort of an actual location,
I think so.
It's also like a biblical theme. I guess what I'm saying is, you say the word wilderness, it might have a particular place that comes to mind whenever I say that word.
Good point.
But it could also mean multiple places, right?
Yeah.
Like I say wilderness, you could be thinking about the wilderness we're probably talking about tonight, which is the wilderness of Sinai. Sinai Peninsula, that area. You could be thinking of the deserts in the Texas, New Mexico, Nevada area. You might be thinking of that. You could be thinking of an actual desert, like the Sahara. There's lots of different places that qualify as wilderness.
I was thinking metaphorical.
Mm-hmm.
You have been through the wilderness of illness this week.
That's true.
And so I get this idea of wilderness. The man's had a temperature. Had to miss 2 days of school. In fact, I think he's over here breathing on me right now with the temperature. Are you?
Last I checked, I didn't have a temperature.
Look at you. But it seems to come and go. He's a little bit inconsistent on temperatations.
Yeah, so...
The wilderness of illness.
The wilderness, yes. So you could go with metaphorical wildernesses as well.
But it does that in a biblical sense, so doesn't it? The idea that we're coming out of the wilderness of sin and into righteousness, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. We'll kind of get into this, but it's a little hard to decide if wilderness has a positive or negative connotation in the Bible.
Yeah.
So, whenever I say wilderness, I immediately think something negative, right? Like you just pointed out, this idea of...
I do too.
This wilderness of... we kind of think of it as like trials,
yes,
right? So,
yes.
You say, I've gone through this wilderness of sickness. What you mean is, man, it was really hard for you to be sick.
Right.
This is a trial that you've gone through, this illness. But it's not always that way in Scripture. Sometimes it is.
Hey, Siri, define the word wilderness. We just jump.
Yeah.
Maybe you're going to do this. Are you going to throw it up there?
I'm not going to throw it up
Well,
there.
then I'm going to tell you.
So.
Siri says it's an uncultivated, uninhabited, and inhospitable region. Inhospitable.
And
that's kind of getting to your point.
Yeah, exactly. So, we get this idea of inhospitable, and so we kind of get this idea that the wilderness is a harsh place.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's not particularly inviting. And that seems to be one of the ideas in Scripture, but it doesn't seem to be the complete idea.
Yeah, I don't know you're going to go here, but sometimes the wilderness is a place of refuge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are going to go there, actually.
I'm not going to speak of it then.
So, you asked me to put the questions in front. So, these are the questions for our SBS students.
Yeah, we've been going not last time, because I had my other son in here, and they're both, I don't know, but the last time, he went an hour and 20 minutes. And I'm thinking my SBS students, they're out there thinking to themselves, how am I going to find the answers? I got to traverse an hour and 20 minutes, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. He actually put it off on me because last week was shorter when he had his little brother over here, bigger brother, they were, doing, and he says, well, Dad, it's only long when you're sitting there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, so you can, I don't know, take pictures of that or something.
We're just going to move on from that. He's trying to make up time this time. Go ahead.
And we should probably go through and calculate how much time you spend talking.
Well, it's not as much as you, I guarantee it.
Well, mine might be a reasonable amount of time if we cut out all of what you say. So.
Okay.
Anyway, so now you've got the questions ahead of time, so you can be looking for the answers to all of these questions as we go through and talk about this stuff.
Over the next hour and a half, be looking for those 5.
Maybe you won't talk as much this time.
That's right. I will not say another word in the next 3 or 4.
So we're going to talk about the history of the wilderness, which, again, since the wilderness isn't an actual location per se, it's a little bit odd to talk about the history of the wilderness.
Yeah,
you can talk, Dad. It's
Thanks.
okay. So anyway, we're going to talk about really the history of the idea of the wilderness, I guess, in the Bible. So we're not going to talk about a particular place tonight. I was thinking about talking about the Negev, but I decided against it. We'll talk a little bit about the Negev. But anyway, so we're talking about this idea in Scripture of the wilderness. And kind of what you see is this brief breakdown of the idea of wilderness throughout biblical history. Is, first of all, you have this idea that whenever the world is created, it's first kind of described as this wilderness, and that's our first mention of wilderness. So we'll get to that in a minute. But you kind of have this idea of wilderness. This blank slate is what we have at the beginning. Then you have, obviously, the children of Israel wander in the wilderness.
I know that one.
Which is kind of what we're going to be talking about later on in this lesson, is the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness, which is the obvious one, right? Like, whenever I say wilderness, that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
40 years.
Yeah. Then you have Elijah, whenever he's fleeing from the prophets of Baal, or rather from Jezebel, really.
Yeah.
Whenever he's fleeing from Jezebel,
he just whooped up on the prophets of Baal.
Yes, yeah, he killed 450 of them. And then, it's a weird story.
That's an odd story. Oh, Jezebel, she got his number, and so... I mean, he just
what,
caught a fireball from heaven, and he's afraid old Jezebel?
Yeah, what's she going to do to him that
I know.
The prophets of Baal can't do?
Every time I say Jezebel, I think Yzma. That show Emperor's New Groove. That's what I think of with Jezebel. I think she's all that, but she's not. All right, that's all I'm going to say the rest of the time. Go ahead.
So Elijah flees into the wilderness. Pictured here, we have Mount Sinai.
Oh, yeah?
Which is actually, obviously, it's in the wilderness.
Correct.
That's kind of, it's not really part of the wilderness wanderings, because they go there first and then they have their wilderness wanderings later. But it's on the Exodus route. It's also where Elijah goes. Whenever he's fleeing, he goes to Mount Sinai, basically thinking, this is where God talked to Moses. So, if you want to go to meet God, go to Mount Sinai.
Go to Mount Sinai. That's a good idea.
Yeah, and he kind of
actually
does.
Talks to God.
Yeah, so I guess it worked.
He may go.
Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't really work out well for Elijah.
Yeah. That's true.
God's
and
like, I'm going to go find your replacement, so...
That's right. Both times, even with Moses, it's a little stormy.
That's true. But God was in the storm with Moses, and he wasn't with Elijah, so...
That's true. And Elijah's first message is, go find your replacement, buddy. You're out of here. Okay, I'm done. That's good.
Yeah, so that's Elijah. And then Jesus,
yeah.
Obviously, whenever he's tempted for 40 days, he goes into the wilderness to fast and be tempted. So you kind of have this idea, again, of wilderness as trials, right?
Right.
That Jesus goes into the wilderness specifically to be tempted. So you kind of have that connection there. I think you can also say, though, that Jesus seems to go into the wilderness whenever he wants to meet God.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's kind of this odd connection of, like, who is it that actually is in the wilderness? You can kind of get this idea that if you go into the wilderness, then that means you're going and you're going to, like, meet up face to face with the devil, and you're going to have this, duke it out or something like Jesus does.
Right.
But then you also have this idea that Jesus actually goes there to meet God as well, and so it's sort of unclear.
Yeah, I was thinking too of the, and I'm struggling to find it here, but the woman in the Book of Revelation. Mm-hmm. Are you going to mention that?
I am going to mention that. Yes.
Me and my big mouth. We'll deal with it later. Go ahead.
All right. So the first mention of wilderness in the Bible.
Genesis 1.
Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep." So that term there, without form and void, typically whenever we say that, I think we kind of get this idea that like the world was this amorphous blob.
Say that word again?
Amorphous.
You just looked that one up. You did pull that out of your head, I know.
Wow.
Did you really have that in there?
Yes.
Amorphous.
Amorphous.
A means no. Morphous. Without form?
Yeah, something like that.
Amorphous.
Amorphous blob. No, but I think we kind of get this idea that, if you looked at it from space, it would be like this odd, not really shaped, like it's
globe.
not a globe, like, like we think of it as this ball in space. And I think we kind of get the idea from this passage that it wasn't a ball in space. But I'm not sure that's actually the implication that it's trying to set out here. So basically what it says in Hebrew is a little bit different, I guess, because it always is a little bit different. But in Hebrew, the idea really doesn't seem to be so much that it doesn't have a shape as it is that it's kind of, this wasteland almost. And so the idea in Hebrew doesn't really seem to be what we imagine it so much as it is that it's a wilderness, right? Which is interesting. And so kind of the idea you get is this idea of there's not order in this place yet. So he describes it as this wilderness, almost this desert. And then he immediately says, and God was hovering over the face of the deep waters. So you get this idea that it's a desert and yet it's also an ocean. And, so is it literally either of these things? Maybe. Maybe it's literally an ocean. It's probably not literally a desert, being that God, separates the waters and all of that. But the idea, I think, is he's talking about, creating order. And he's saying that this place is a place without order. And the image he uses to describe that is a desert, a wilderness. Right? So you kind of get this idea from Genesis 1 that wilderness is this unordered place. And again, that doesn't make it a bad thing, right? Like, whenever God comes in, he does create order, and yet he also leaves some of the chaos, right? He doesn't really seem to, he doesn't come in and destroy chaos. He doesn't, do away with all the wildernesses or the oceans or any of those things. Rather, he puts them in their proper place, right? And so you kind of get this idea that this is something that's dangerous and yet not necessarily bad, which is kind of the idea that you get with a lot of things in Scripture.
Absolutely.
It's the same thing with the ocean, right?
Right.
It's this dangerous place where you go out and you get caught in a storm and you're probably going to die. And yet it's not an evil place. The ocean has, it doesn't want to kill you. It just might.
Right.
It doesn't have a will of its own. And so it's not evil, but it is dangerous. And you kind of get this same idea with the wilderness, that it's a neutral space. You might go into the wilderness to meet God, and you might just as easily go into the wilderness and be tempted by the devil. But the wilderness is this neutral space that is dangerous and yet not evil.
That's an interesting point. So it's unlike you were talking about the Dead Sea.
Mm-hmm.
A wilderness is somewhat unlike what happened to the Dead Sea because that place was specifically cursed by God.
Mm-hmm.
A wilderness is more of a place, like you say, that doesn't have the typical order of other places. And yet, as we're evidently going to see, there are times when that's appealing.
Yeah.
You want to go to a place that's not as ordered as it is. I mean, Jesus even withdrew to places of solace, in a place where he could be by himself. I'm not saying that he necessarily wanted disorder, but I think that he did want a different kind of order, a release from the pressures of the order that was on him when he was with the masses. And so he went into the wilderness in that sense. I like that. That's good.
Yeah. You kind of get this idea, like Jesus, whenever he goes into these places, it describes them as like he goes off to lonely places.
Yes, yeah.
And I think, typically we hear that word lonely and we say, well, isn't it bad to be lonely?
Yeah.
And you kind of get the idea, like, no, like sometimes it's bad to be lonely.
Sure.
You don't want to be lonely all of the time. And yet loneliness in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's a neutral thing. If you have too much of it, it's a bad thing. And
good point.
You go off into these lonely places, sometimes you meet God. You have somebody to fill up that lonely void. But sometimes you go off into these lonely places and you don't meet God. Rather, you end up being tempted by your own loneliness. And so I think a lot of things are this way, that they're not good or bad. Rather, they're neutral things. I think money's the same way, right?
Yeah.
Money in Scripture isn't described as being a bad thing. Actually, sometimes it's a good thing. It's good to have money so you can buy food and all of those different things. It's helpful to have money. And yet at the same time, Paul would say, the love of money is the root of all evil. And so, you kind of have this idea of, like, money's not bad, and yet it can be used for bad things.
Right.
And so it's neither. It's not good or bad. It's neutral. And it's the same way with the wilderness.
Interesting point.
And you see this more in Revelation. So Revelation chapter 17, verse 3. This is talking about the harlot that's riding on the dragon. And it says, "And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness." So there's our word. "And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns."
Oh, I think we got a visitor.
We have a visitor.
Another. Oh, look at your mother loves you. She knows you're not feeling well. Come in here, Cindy, and wave at the community so that they know that it's not just. No, you gotta show them more than your hand. Oh man, there she is. I love that woman. Bye, honey. Thank you.
Mother.
Is that the only one we're going to mention from Revelation?
No.
Okay, good, because I was scrambling for the other. All right, go ahead.
So you have this idea very clearly of a bad thing happening in the wilderness, right? So John is taken out into the wilderness to see this prostitute that's sitting on the beast, and basically he's going to go out and watch her destruction, which actually is a good thing. But you kind of get the idea that this wilderness is an evil place because there are evil beings that exist in this wilderness.
Prostitute, beast, 7 heads, 10 horns. All of those things contribute to my negative feelings about this place.
And so we're not going to really get into like the interpretive aspect of Revelation here because I didn't study that out.
Yeah, well, the theme is the wilderness, not the lake.
Yeah, exactly.
If you call it a lake.
So some people think it's the Statue of Liberty, which I think is interesting. But again, I'm not going to give my opinion, except that I think that's wrong. But anyway, so you get this idea that whatever is going on in this passage, regardless of who you are, if you're a Christian and you're reading this passage, you get this idea that it's a bad thing that's going on here, right? And, this prostitute, this beast, these are bad characters in the Bible. And so regardless of what you actually think is going on, you have this idea that it's a negative thing.
Right.
Something evil is happening here. And again, this is tied to this idea of the wilderness. But then, I don't know why I had that twice. But again, Revelation chapter 12.
So this is earlier.
This is the one you
This is the one I've been trying to get in.
Yeah. Revelation 12. So it's earlier. It says, "And the woman who's probably Mary, if you want to get a little bit more metaphorical, maybe it's like the church. But either way, you have this idea again of this woman, except now it's definitely a positive thing.
Yeah, I think it's Israel.
Okay, so it's Israel. Regardless of your interpretation, though.
Well, the church would make it upside down. It would make
the
church giving birth to Jesus, which is kind of...
No, I guess you're right. Anyway, so regardless of how metaphorical you want to get with this, this is definitely a good person that we're talking about.
Definitely.
You have the idea that this person just gives birth to Jesus, and then the dragon comes and he's trying to eat Jesus, but then Jesus is taken up into heaven, and then this woman flees, and it says she flees into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days.
Interesting. Prepared by God.
Yeah, exactly. So you have, a contrast there, right? You have this idea that in the first story, which is actually the second story, but it was the last time it's mentioned.
The prostitute lady.
Yes. You have the prostitute lady, who is clearly this bad character who's living in the wilderness, and then you have this other, this good woman who is living in the wilderness because God actually prepared a place for her to live in the wilderness. And so you have these contrasting ideas of the wilderness. Again, I think proving the point that the wilderness is not a good or a bad thing. Rather, it's this neutral space. I think the idea is it's a blank space, right? And so whenever God comes in and he creates things in Genesis 1, he basically comes in and he finds this blank canvas that he can create things on.
Good point, yeah.
And so he comes in and he makes the world out of this blank canvas.
It's interesting.
And
which is not unlike what's happening here, because it clearly says there's the wilderness. Then he has a place prepared by God. Mm-hmm. He takes the blank canvas, and at least in part of it, he says, I'm preparing this place for this woman.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So you kind of get this idea that the wilderness is what you make of it. Right?
Wow.
Which I think we have, even with our negative idea of the wilderness in our times, that wilderness moments are
definitely
what you make of it.
Well said.
That, being sick or losing a job or all kinds of different things that happen to us in life that we say this is a trial, this is a wilderness moment, that those things are what you make of it. And if you make it into something good, you find God in those moments, then those can be good things. And if in those moments you only find temptation, then probably they're not going to be good things.
Yeah, it's almost as if in these moments, if I can present God with my blank slate, my wilderness, and say, I don't really want to be here, but since I am, will you shape it into something for you?
Yeah.
And when you do that, man, the power that comes from that whole idea of God being in control of my wilderness, which, back to your point, is a neutral location. Mm-hmm. And so I'm essentially saying to God, take my neutrality and give it purpose.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the story we're going to look at tonight is Numbers chapter 13.
Numbers 13.
And 14, a little bit. And kind of going along with this theme that we've had so far, is Israel is having a wilderness moment. Right? I mean, they're literally in the wilderness.
Right.
And they come to the promised land. And the problem is that what they make of this wilderness moment is not what God would have them make of it. And they get punished for that.
Yeah, I had never thought of it that way, but you're right. All the way up to the doorstep of the promised land, this is designed by God. Mm-hmm. And it's still wilderness.
Yeah.
It's not a negative. When they leave out of Sinai, they are... hey, we're going to the promised land. And they've got all their packing orders and all that. It's a whole positive scenario as they go right up to the doorstep. This is all a positive wilderness, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And now we turn to, what are you going to make of it?
Yeah, exactly. And what you kind of find, honestly, is the children of Israel constantly want to make something bad out of this wilderness.
Yeah, that's the truth.
And yet God constantly wants to make something good out of it.
Yeah.
And so you have this kind of contrast, is they have God in their midst. And so despite their complaining and their sin, God continuously blesses them anyway.
Yeah.
You know, there is punishment, there is bad things, there are bad things that happen, and yet there's also a lot of blessing to be had in this story, despite their disobedience.
Yeah, I mean, they got bread falling out the heavens, they got quail coming right in so low they can scoop it up. I mean, they're taken care of pretty well. And water goes bad, guess what? God says, throw a stick in that thing and we'll make it taste good.
Yeah.
And if you can't get it from there, hit a rock.
Or talk to it.
Yeah. I think one time he was supposed to hit it, wasn't he?
I think so.
But the second time is what got him in trouble.
Yeah. So anyway, we have this idea of the wilderness is what you make of it. And so kind of what we're talking about tonight is the way that you make the wilderness into something good. And the way that you do that is by placing your faith in God rather than in yourself.
Well, that's the truth.
And so, I mean, that's kind of what this story is all about.
Definitely.
In Numbers 13 is this question of where is it that you're going to place your trust. So, Numbers 13, verses 1 through 3. First off, we get this idea that the spies that they're going to be sending out are actually courageous leaders, which is interesting. So, I'll go ahead and read it. In Numbers 13, verses 1 through 3, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them." So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran, according to the command of the Lord, all of them men who were heads of the people of Israel. So first off, we see that these 12 spies that he's sending out are leaders of the people of Israel. It's going to go through and actually list all of their names, but Joshua and Caleb are the only important ones, so I decided not to.
The rest of them, they die.
Yeah, I decided not to read the list.
Yeah, Joshua and Caleb, that covers it.
Yes, but you know, they go through all the 12 tribes. They leave out Levi because you know, he's the priestly tribe, and they get both tribes of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. They get one representative from each of them, so there's still 12. And anyway, so they get leaders from all of these 12 tribes, which is an interesting idea, I think, because what this ultimately shows is that these are people that are people of influence, right?
Correct.
I'm not sure that you would typically do that with spies. You know, that you would say, no, I want to pick somebody that's like actually really important to go out and scout the land. That doesn't seem to be. I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, tactically speaking. But I'm very bad at strategy games, so maybe I'm not as good of a tactician as I think I am. But, you know, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? That you would say, yeah, let's take the most important guys in each of the tribes, and we're going to send them out into the land and see what happens. And we'll see if they come back or not. Right? And so they do. They send these guys out. The other thing, though, that's interesting is it seems like there's this indication that these men maybe were actually picked to lead by the people, which for us, I think, you know, kind of gives us this idea of like, who are we going to pick to lead us? Kind of. It actually has two ideas, I think. For followers, it says, you know, the person that you choose to be your leader, the person that you choose to follow is important. And then for leaders, it says, actually kind of the same thing, that as you lead, the person that you choose to follow should be Jesus. And so imitate him, and other people will imitate you as you're imitating him. You know, kind of the Paul thing that's going on here. And so these men are chosen because of their leadership ability, because of their influence, which implies that these are the people that should know better than to do what they do at the end of the story.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I think also, if I might add, being that they represent the tribes, when they get back, God is going to get a pretty good cross section of representation with regards to faith. Who, because each of these guys, they represent, a segment of the population. And if they don't have faith, it's likely that the people below them aren't going to have faith either. And at the end of the day, you can see why God's pretty fed up with these folks. But go ahead.
Yeah. And what you end up finding out is Judah is one tribe that sends out a representative that actually is faithful, which, again, if that shows any level of the faith of the people, then Judah's a faithful tribe, which makes sense because they're kind of the best one, other than maybe Levi. And then the other one, Ephraim, kind of seems to be standing in for Levi, right? Because Levi doesn't send out a representative, again, because they're the priestly tribe.
Interesting point.
And what it actually says in the text is it talks about Manasseh and says, the tribe of Joseph, which is Manasseh, sends out this representative. And then it talks about Ephraim, and it says the tribe of Ephraim sends out Joshua, son of Nun. And so it doesn't mention Joseph at all. And so I think kind of the idea is, this is just me talking, but I think kind of the idea is Ephraim is replacing Levi. And then Manasseh is, this is the tribe of Joseph, right? So because they replace Levi, that kind of makes them, again, this faithful tribe.
That's a powerful point.
And that's what they are, right? I mean, Joshua goes in and he is this faithful leader, at least. He's going to lead all of Israel faithfully. So you get this idea that all of these men are leaders. But you also get this idea that all of these men are courageous people, which is odd, because I don't think we typically think of them that way.
Yeah, definitely not. When you look at the conclusion of the story, 10 were bad, 2 were good.
Yeah.
You always go with the bad, and man, talk about a bunch of weenies.
Mm-hmm.
We can't do it. So I don't get this idea of them being courageous, but go ahead and prove it to me.
Anyway, so what you get out of this idea is Moses sends them out, and he gives them these very particular directions. He says, I want you to go into the land, and I want you to basically scout everything out, right? I want you to see what the people are like. Are they strong or are they weak? Do they live in open camps or are they in fortified cities? And then he also says, and I want you to look at the land itself, right? Which seems like probably that was the idea, actually, of the whole thing. Is not, I want you to go in and discover whether or not these guys can take us in a fight, because they can't.
Right, we got God.
Yeah, exactly. But it seems like really the idea is I want you to go in and discover how fruitful the land actually is. So you can come back and tell the people, right? This land is exactly as good as God said that it was.
Yeah.
And what you find out is that the spies actually do what Moses said to do. So Numbers 13, verse 20 says, find out, I'm paraphrasing that first, but find out whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not. Be of good courage, and bring some of the fruit of the land. So Moses, basically, he tells them, I want you to be brave, I want you to be courageous, and then he says that the way that we're going to know whether or not you're courageous is if you bring back any fruit, right? If you bring any of the produce of the land, that's how we're going to know that you're courageous men. And what's interesting is that's what they do. So it says the time was the season of the first ripe grapes, and then verse 23, and they came to the valley of Eshcol and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between 2 of them. They also brought some pomegranates and figs. So you get this idea that these are really big grapes, right?
If they're carrying it on a pole.
That's... I've never seen a cluster of grapes that big.
Not that would need a pole.
Yeah. So it's a lot of grapes, or very large grapes. It's not really clear. But, you kind of get this idea, this land is definitely as fruitful as God said it was. Maybe even more so. Maybe God downplayed this a little bit.
Yeah.
But they do. again, Moses says, if you're brave, if you're courageous, what I want you to do is I want you to go and get some of the fruit of the land. And then that's what they do, right?
Sure.
They go into the land.
Right.
The other thing is what they actually do, what they're described as doing, is they go into the land down here at the Negev. I said we would point this out.
Here's the Negev.
Yes, that's the Negev. They go in at the Negev or the Negev.
Oh, so this is when they are actually going to end. Okay, later.
Yeah,
so they're going to go in first time. They go in this way.
Yeah, they go in that way. So they go in through the Negev, and Negev basically just means south, right? It's just like the southernmost part of Canaan.
Okay.
Is the idea. But they go in through the southernmost part of Canaan, and then it says that they go all the way up to Tyre inside.
Oh, wow.
Wait, so it's like they go all the way north, right?
Yeah.
Which basically means that they cover the whole land. They see everything. And I think, again, that takes bravery, right?
Sure.
You have this, obviously they're courageous men because they go into this land, they discover that there's giants there, and yet they go through the whole thing. They see everything. For 40 days they're in the land, and then they come back. They do exactly what Moses told them to do. So you see that these men are courageous men. They are leaders. They have good reason to be leaders because apparently, they're courageous enough to actually go and get the job done.
For 40 days.
For 40 days.
They are surviving in this, what could be a very hostile area, if they find out anything about the bunch of folks who's camped just south of there. So for 40 days, they're all over the place looking. They're spying. That takes courage to do that, And so, yeah, I get your point now that I think there has to be, at least initially, an understanding that these guys had a level of courage to even be willing to carry out their responsibility that Moses gives them.
Yeah. But that courage doesn't last very long.
I know, that's the point. They just got done 40 days surviving, but no, guys, we can't do it.
Yeah, and I think the idea here is that their faith, their courage, is put in the wrong place. So Numbers 13, again, verses 31 through 33. Then the men who had gone up with him said, and so the spies have come back, and now they're giving their report to Moses.
Okay.
They said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are." So they brought to the people a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to be, we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Right? So basically, what they say is, we went in and we discovered that we can't handle it. Right? They're so much bigger than us that we look like grasshoppers in our own sight, and we look like grasshoppers to them. We would say probably something more like we look like ants. But you get this idea of we ourselves can't do it. So you kind of get the idea that the reason these men are courageous is because they have faith in themselves.
Yeah.
And so as long as they can take care of it, they are courageous. They're brave. They go in and they take care of business. These are good leaders, but these are the kinds of men that have faith in themselves rather than faith in God.
Yeah, I was looking back through their little report here, and I don't see a single mention of God in anything that they say.
Yeah, exactly. So you kind of get this idea that it's a matter of like where their faith actually lies, right? And the thing is, I think we, at least in America, have this same tendency towards faith in ourselves, right? So whenever Judah comes over, he comes over about once a week on Sundays, and I'm kind of like the de facto babysitter, right? That he comes over and everybody just kind of assumes that
Uncle,
yeah. I'm going to take care of him. And so I do most of the time. We play for about as long as I can handle, which is like 20 minutes. And then once we're done with that, sometimes we get to watch TV if I can convince him. Turns out I like children's television more than Judah does, because he just wants to play all the time, and I get tired of that. But anyway, so we watch a lot of TV together, and what I discovered is there's kind of this common theme throughout children's television, something that probably everybody's heard, which is this idea of you can do anything as long as you believe in yourself.
Yeah.
Right? And it's kind of this idea that I don't think we really, we don't think we believe it. Let me put it that way.
Why would they say it if they thought we believed it?
Yeah. And so we don't think we believe it, and yet I think we actually do believe it.
Yeah.
Like as adults, we would say, no, I'm too old. I'm too mature for that kind of kiddie stuff. This idea of believe in yourself, honestly. But more adult-geared television, you have this idea of like the only person you can trust is yourself.
Yeah.
Or you can only rely on yourself. So it's the same idea, except we made it more mature by taking out the optimism.
Yeah.
Or you kind of get this idea of like self-help books, right? It's the same lie of you can do anything if you believe in yourself, except now instead of it being this cartoon telling a kid you can walk on the moon if you believe in yourself, it's adults telling themselves that if I believe in myself, if I do the right things or say the right things, that I can fix my money, relationship, career, whatever. I can fix all of these problems that I have in my personal life. And so basically what we discover is that throughout all of it, we are all buying into this same lie.
Wow.
Of if I have faith in myself, if I believe in myself, I can do anything. And we teach people this, and then they kind of have one of two ways of responding, right? There's only really two options. Well, I guess there's three. You could reject it. You could say, no, I'm going to believe in something different than myself, which is the proper response. But then the other two responses are, number one, if I accept this, then my responses are either I become depressed because I realize,
I'm not.
And I believe in myself, and I'm not very good at most of this stuff, and so I become depressed, and I recognize that I'm not good enough to do most of these things. Or number two, I start to blame everybody for all of my mistakes.
Yeah.
Right? So basically, in other words, this all becomes a pride issue.
Definitely.
Either my pride is so hurt that I just become depressed and I stop doing anything because my pride is so hurt by this, or I try to save my pride by making this everybody else's problem. I see this all the time at school.
Yeah.
Right? If I don't get my homework done, then what I do is I say, well, either it was all of my other teachers, I was busy doing their homework, and so I didn't have time to complete this homework assignment, so it's my teacher's fault. Or I say, well, we didn't have internet at school. How many times have I heard that one? All the time. We didn't have internet at school because we don't have internet at school a lot of the time. So what does that mean? Well, it means I should have gone to Starbucks. There's internet in other places than college. What we discover is that there are ways of solving problems, and if I don't take those ways, then that actually means I'm creating the problem for myself.
Wow.
Right? So, if I get a speeding ticket, I don't have to blame the police officer for pulling me over. It's probably it was that I was speeding.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes maybe it's not. But most of the time I think that's fair, right?
Right?
It's fair to assume that if I have a problem, it was probably my fault.
Yeah.
And so if we want to get out of this rut of believe in myself, this pride issue, I think what we ultimately have to start doing is we have to start admitting our mistakes.
Wow. Personal responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. I think the pride issue is the reason we don't have confession in the church like we're supposed to, is we recognize that if I confess my sins, then that's me admitting that I can't do everything.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That some of these things actually are my fault. And so, we try our best to make sure that I save face in front of other people.
Yeah.
That I protect my pride in front of other human beings. Whenever all that's doing is making sure that we don't save face in front of the one person that actually matters.
Wow.
Because God is very forgiving, right?
Right.
And if we confess our sins, then He's faithful to forgive us our sins. That's 1 John. And so we kind of have this idea, right, that if we are able to put down our pride, we are able to put our faith in God rather than ourselves, then He can fix those things.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We still make those mistakes. Sometimes we still don't get our homework done, or we still get speeding tickets, or we preach a sermon that's not quite as good as I wanted it to be. Right? That happens. It happens all the time, and yet there's a couple options there. Right? You could admit maybe it's something that I did. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes there are moments whenever life just happens.
Sure.
And you say, well, I didn't have time to do this. But even in those moments, I think what's best is to say, no excuse is the best excuse. I'm sorry that this thing happened, and I will take responsibility for it. But that's the problem with having faith or belief in ourselves, is that ultimately, if I believe in myself, if I put all of my trust in me, then all of my problems become my fault.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
And so if I do that, then there is no putting this off on somebody else, because it ultimately it's my fault whenever I make mistakes. And what Jesus ultimately does is He comes in and He says, yes, it is our faults, and yet He's willing to take that blame away from us, right? It's not His fault that we sin, and yet He takes that guilt, He takes away, the very idea of sin. He takes the shame of the sin away from us. So if we give Him, if we put our faith in Him, then it takes away that pride issue that we have.
Which turns us back to our folks who just got back from scouting the Promised Land.
Yeah.
If they had they've just been through the wilderness, and if they could, as you pointed out in the introduction, if they could present God with their blank slate, the wilderness, and they could say, God, what are you going to make of this? Imagine how things would have changed. Well, I guarantee you there would have been a different folk who inherited the Promised Land. And there would have been a 40-year period that wasn't wasted wandering around if they had just presented their wilderness to God.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of what you see is that ultimately the theme of Numbers is this idea of we're going to inherit the Promised Land, right? That's what's going on throughout most of the Pentateuch, honestly. Is Genesis is largely about the fact that God has promised a land to Abraham and a family, but you get both of those promises, right? And then Exodus is about we're not in that land, and so we got to leave this land, and so we do. And then Leviticus is about this idea of how are we going to live with God in that land, because we want to take God with us, right? That's the thing that makes the Promised Land good, is the fact that God is going to be there with us, and so how are we going to live with God in that land? And then Numbers is about this idea of we're going and we're going to take the land. And then we get to chapter 13 and 14, and we don't.
Yeah. Right? And we don't.
We don't. And so we spend the rest of the time wondering, and then eventually the second generation goes and they start the mission over again, right?
Which is Deuteronomy.
Yes.
The second time.
Yeah,
We're going to give the law again because you guys couldn't get it right the first time.
Yeah. So, we get this, broad picture. All of this is about whether or not we're going to inherit the land.
Yeah.
And ultimately what you see is that the test of whether or not you inherit the land is where you put your faith.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So, next part of the story, Numbers 14, verses 7 through 9, almost in response to what we just read, that these spies are talking bad about the land. They're bringing this bad report because there's giants living in the land. They say all of this. They get the people riled up, and then Joshua and Caleb, they rebut. They respond like this. And Joshua and Caleb said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, "The land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them."
Amen, guys.
All right, so Joshua and Caleb, they again, they're two of these 12 spies. They're all brave. They're all leaders, and yet these are the only ones that have their faith placed in the proper place. They have their faith in God. And you can see that in what they say. They say, if God is pleased with us,
right,
he'll let us inherit the land.
Yeah.
And their protection's removed from them, and the Lord is with us.
Yeah.
Don't fear them, right? So Joshua and Caleb, they're no different from the other spies, except that their faith is in the proper place.
Yes.
They say, my faith isn't going to be in me. I don't believe in myself. Rather, I believe in God.
Yeah.
God works through me.
The 10, we are grasshoppers compared to them. The heroic 2, God's given us bread. They're like bread for us. We'll go in there and just eat them up.
Yeah, exactly.
And so again, where's the two perspectives? Is I can't do it because I'm a little grasshopper. The other 2 guys, this is a feast, guys. Come on, let's get after it.
Yeah, and I think kind of the idea is that maybe I think they're reversing the idea, right? It's kind of the first guys are saying they're going to eat us up.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? We're like little grasshoppers that they could just pick us up and we're not even a big meal.
Yeah.
And then Joshua and Caleb come in and they say, no, we're gonna eat them, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We've got this because we have God on our side. And so you have this idea that what all of this story is about is, where is your faith placed, right? Probably there's a lot of themes that you could uncover in this story, but ultimately what you discover is the thing that makes the difference in the wilderness of what you're going to make out of it is where you place your faith. And so we come from this culture that values work above pretty much everything else, right? And so we have this idea that what you make of the wilderness comes from how much you're willing to work, right? That's if you do the right things, you say the right things, then things will work out, and that's how you make the wilderness something good. But the story of Numbers 13 and 14 is not that.
Mm-mm.
It seems like the 10 spies work just as hard as Joshua and Caleb do, but ultimately the blessing is on Joshua and Caleb because they place their faith in the right place.
Yeah.
And so that's really the question for all of us, is where are we placing our faith? And so you get Numbers 14, 28 through 29 is the results of all of this, right?
On to the results.
Which we've kind of spoiled, but
we did.
I think we've kind of talked about this whole thing through the perspective of 10 were bad and 2 were good.
Yeah.
And everybody knows what's going to happen. Anyway, it says, "Say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness." So basically the people said that why didn't you just let us die in the wilderness? Why can't we go back to Egypt? All of these different things, grumbling against God. We don't want to go into the promised land. And so God has made this promise, and he's brought his people all the way up to the point of receiving it, and they say, we don't want the promise.
Yeah.
And God says, okay, then, you're not going to get it. You want to die in the wilderness, then you can die in the wilderness.
Well, again, you see that selfish focus of their blank slate, the wilderness. Mm-hmm. Instead of handing it to God and say, you make it, they say, God, the wilderness is death to us. Mm-hmm. Why didn't you let us go there? And God says, okay, you've painted your own picture. You've filled in your own script.
Yeah.
Go to the wilderness and die.
Yeah, exactly. And so I like that point that what you make of it ultimately isn't supposed to be what you make of it.
Yeah, that's good. Ultimately. Somebody write that down. That's actually a pretty good quote. Say it again.
What you make of it isn't supposed to be what you make of it.
That's good.
It's supposed to be rather about letting God make what he wants to make of it.
Yeah.
And so they don't do that. And so God says, your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness, and all of your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward. So the reason the book of Numbers is called Numbers, right, is chapter 1, we start this big long census of all the people. We count everybody. And God basically says, remember that? Remember chapter 1 whenever we remember why we call this book Numbers. It's not called Numbers in Hebrew, by the way. But he says, remember this very first story, the first thing that happens to you guys. We're going to reverse that, right? We took this census, and now everybody that was listed in the census, which is basically everybody that's old enough to be in the army, all of those people are going to die in the wilderness. And then the people that weren't numbered in the census, the people that are young enough that they weren't allowed to be in the army yet, those people are the ones that get to go into the wilderness.
Into the promised land.
Yes, in the promised land. So he says, listed in the census from 20 years old and upwards who have grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. Right? And so we have this idea that ultimately you get to be the exception. Right? You get to be exceptional. Right? You get to be these kinds of people that get to go into the promised land if you put your faith in the right place.
Yeah.
If you let God make out of the wilderness what he wants to make out of it. And that's kind of the moral of this story, is where does your faith lie? Well, your faith should be in God rather than in yourself. And so we see that ultimately the story boils down to those people that put their faith in God get to receive the promises. Right? And so next week, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Joshua and Caleb coming into the promised land, destroying Jericho, because it's geography, right?
I've been
Jericho's on the map, so we're going to talk about Jericho. But ultimately, that's the story, is that these people, Joshua and Caleb, they put their faith in the proper place, and because of that, they get the promises of God. They get to go in and defeat Jericho.
That's so good. One little aside I might make to that is I think it's also interesting that Joshua and Caleb come out of this story being the big heroes. I mean, Moses is not even going in. Aaron's not going in. So Joshua and Caleb, the big heroes of this. But even they wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. Meaning that even though they are the heroes, for the sake of God's remnant, the heroes had to maintain their faith through those 40 years, being this living example. All those lower than 20 years old are going to be growing up hearing the stories of why they didn't go into the promised land. And they are going to one day have to be people who receive the Deuteronomy, the second giving of the law, so that they're prepared to go into the promised land. But all those 40 years, you still got our two heroes who have to hang tough.
Yeah.
And I think there's a big application for you and I there as well, and that you and I might very well be the faithful, and you ask yourself, well, why am I still here? Mm-hmm. Well, ask Joshua and Caleb why they had to wander for 40 years. It wasn't a punishment.
Yeah, and I mean, the same thing seems to happen to Moses, right?
Good point. Good point.
It doesn't say here, I'm going to let Moses go into the land, but it's kind of implied that Moses is going to get to go in. And then Moses strikes the rock, and God says, okay, now I'm not going to let you go into the land.
Right.
So there is kind of this idea that Moses is right there with them, but because he's not faithful throughout all of the wilderness experience, he doesn't get to enter the promised land.
And I think also, it also kind of alludes to the fact that the option was there for Joshua and Caleb to screw up during the 40 years. They could have shown their own lack of faith and been disbarred, if you will, from going into the promised land, but they evidently did not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So ultimately, this wilderness experience becomes something in which the people get to show off their own character, right? And so sometimes you end up being a little bit like Moses, and you show off your character, and you're kind of an angry, curmudgeonly guy. And I think Moses is going to be in heaven, so I think he's all right. Seems pretty implied. God liked Moses, but he's not as good as Joshua.
At least in this particular situation,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't know. It seems kind of implied that Joshua is a better leader than Moses. He does a lot less to mess up. Of course, he's leader for a lot less of the time. But
Moses was around a long time.
He was around a long time.
Can I give a little story that just came to me before we shut this thing?
Sure.
Years ago, Gabriel always liked to draw. Still does. Phenomenal. And if those of you who tune into other things we got going, the Doodle Bible School or the Joy of Doodling, whatever, that's all this guy's talent, But I can remember when you were younger, and I guess you just drawn out everything you wanted to draw, and you'd come to me with a blank sheet of paper. And he would say, Dad, draw me a picture. And I think that I didn't know it then, but I think there's a powerful application that, that's the way it is with God. I'm not saying I'm God. I'm just saying that, you come to God and you give him a blank sheet of paper, my wilderness, and you say, draw me a picture. And it's sweet because I remember when that happened, that Gabriel would snuggle up to me and he would eventually find him a crayon. And as I'm drawing the picture, he's putting his little doodles in beside mine. And it was a moment that I think takes us back to the Eden where God just wanted to do it together.
Yeah. And kind of what you discover about Joshua going along with that story is there's this interesting passage. The first time Joshua is introduced. So it's in Exodus. And basically what it says is Moses would go out and he'd pitch his tent outside the town or whatever it is, the nation, I guess. And he'd pitch his tent, and the glory of the Lord would come and talk to Moses. And then it says, and Joshua was there, and he wouldn't leave the tent of meeting.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's kind of why I think Joshua might be a little bit better than Moses, is he is this character that goes into the presence of God, and he says, this is where I want to be all the time.
Ouch.
Don't take me anywhere else. I want to be in the presence of God.
That's good. Gives me all over. Good stuff, son.
Well, thank you. All right, so that's our podcast for this week. Next week we're going to talk about the walls of Jericho. So that should be an exciting lesson. But until then, I don't know. We don't have a sign-off, do we?
I don't think we have a sign-off.
Yeah. I'll talk to you next week.